everyone, Dennis Spillman here, and today I'm at the Oklahoma City Museum where I'm going to give you a one-on-one tour with the guest curator and close personal friend of Paul Reed in this amazing retrospective at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. This tour that you're about to see is about an hour long. It's pretty comprehensive. We do hit up every room. However, there are over 100 pieces of work, so obviously you're not going to see and learn about everything, but you're going to learn a ton about Paul Reed. So let's get to that tour.
Welcome to this exhibition. This is the first major retrospective on the art of Paul Reed. Part of the DC Color School movement in the 1960s. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and I'm the guest curator of this exhibition. It's the largest exhibition ever mounted on the art of Paul Reed. It is retrospective. It covers all of his work, more or less, from his earliest works to works he was doing right up to the years of his death. The exhibition is laid out chronologically, and it does very nicely map the terrain of Paul's career. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1919. He went to high school, grammar school and high school in Washington, D.C. Interesting is that in high school he also was, his friends going to high school were the artists Thomas Marion and Gene Davis. So the three artists who were part of this D.C. Color School essentially grew up together as young boys in Washington, D.C. The exhibition, as I said, is chronological, and the earliest works are the works that relate to a couple of things. Paul Reed began his career really as a graphic designer, and he worked for a number of design firms in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta, in New York City, in New Jersey. So that early training was very important for him. It was only in the 50s, the early 50s, that he began to think about transitioning away from graphic design, which nonetheless had been important for just his livelihood, but to begin to experiment with the idea of painting. And he worked initially with small scale painting in his, for the most part, in his house. This is the earliest work in the exhibition. It's a self-portrait of Paul Reed from 1938 as a young man, and this was done, in fact, when he was a graphic designer working in Atlanta. As I said, by 1952 or so, he was beginning to be less concerned with graphic design and wanted to sort of approach the idea of painting, and an early work is over here. This work in the exhibition, which is a small study in colored inks, shows you what was in fact his early, we might say, inspiration, as it would have been for many artists working in the 1950s in America, and that would have been the artists of the New York School in New York City, the so-called abstract expressionists. So you'll notice, even though this is a small work, it's based on a very lively application of the paint. There's movement, there's expressiveness. It has all of the trade marks of more or less a New York School type of study. And this is, in fact, a study. So he was working on the idea of many small-scale works that he was just experimenting with. This takes us to really this first part of the exhibition. And these are the works that more or less pertain to this early period when he's thinking about abstract expressionism and trying to deal with it. And so there are influences in all of these paintings by different New York School painters. This painting here, most of these are untitled. They're early works from the 50s, and this is a painting that really sort of owes a debt to an artist like Willem de Kooning. As we move down to this painting, you can see that he's thinking of an artist like Hans Hofmann with these blocks and squares of paint that sort of vibrate and pulsate. And then certainly in a painting like this, he's thinking of Jackson Pollock. And in fact, what he was doing here, it's interesting what this painting is about, is that he actually started with a painting by Edouard Manet. It was a Manet still life of flowers in a vase. And then he did this version of what would that Manet have looked like if Jackson Pollock altered it. And so it's a kind of a three-level Monet, Pollock, and Paul Reed here, and you can see it has that kind of technique we think about with Pollock, the dripping and the splattering of paint here, but certainly still here you see the recognizable vase. I want to go back for a second to this, what's here. As with most artists, they tend to cycle through various influences and inspirations. So this is a very early work, very obviously different than anything in the exhibition, and it is Paul Reed doing his own copy after Cézanne. This Still Life with Onions is a painting by Paul Cézanne that's in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. So he's looking at Cézanne, and down here, this is a very fragile painting, so it's installed in a particular sort of protective case, is another still life where he's obviously now thinking also about Cubism, Picasso, and even in some of the colors, Matisse. So right here, we have Cézanne, Matisse, and Picasso as artists who he was already thinking that he had to work through, as most painters in the post-war period had to do. So this is an interesting array of early reads that show you how he was thinking about art. Remember, he's coming of age in the 60s, 50s and 60s, and other artists are parallel, and of course two artists that are coming of age in the 50s as well are Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And so in this small study here by Paul Reed, he incorporates newsprint and a part of a newspaper so that it has, much like Rauschenberg, the idea of it's both painterly and expressive, but then your eye grabs onto that actual piece of newsprint or newspaper. So it sort of plays with life and art the way Rauschenberg would do ultimately in his Combine paintings. Let's move on. So the painting that was hanging at the entrance, painting number 17, which is owned by the Oklahoma Museum of Art. And by the way, this exhibition, for the most part, is based on the collection here at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art because they have one of the largest collections of Paul Reed's paintings anywhere. He started with that mandala shape, which has a circular form, and it's, of course, mandala in Sanskrit means circle. So all of these paintings here are a variation on number 17 that we started with at the entrance. That painting was particularly important for the Oklahoma City Museum of Art because it was the first painting that came into their collection here. And it was a painting, there was an exhibition at this museum some years ago about Matisse and his art, and it was at the Pompidou Center, and they asked, when the exhibition was mounted here in Oklahoma, the Pompidou said, we'd like to supplement the exhibition with something from your own collection that would relate to Matisse. And the painting that the Oklahoma curators chose, as well as the Pompidou curators, was that painting at the entrance, number 17. That mandala shape. And here you just see continued variations of that. So we're talking about a centralized form, a square format. There is a kind of, certainly a biomorphic shape. These are shapes, these round organic shapes, these sort of amoeba-like shapes that are all together, which echoes another interest of Paul's, and that was surrealism. So looking at the works of Joan Miro, and Max Ernst and others who began to create these drawings and paintings that had this kind of abstract relationship. So these are, again, early paintings in that sequence. You see here where he has great variety. The painting on the left, which is stained, and I'll talk about that in a second, you'll notice it's almost like he took the integrity of that original shape and kind of almost exploded it. So everything becomes sort of free-flowing now. So it has a much greater emphasis on, it's a more expressive painting, and it has a great subtlety of color. It's not just the centralized form surrounded by blank canvas, but it has a color and a staining throughout. And this is a painting, again, that would be very comparable to some of the works that Matisse was doing at this time. Reed is a very curious artist, and he's very imaginative, but he has an incredible appetite for pushing himself. And as a result, most of Reed's work throughout his career are executed in series, much like Matisse. So he'll start with a particular concept, let's say the mandala shape that you're seeing again here, but he'll push it and he'll experiment with it and he'll vary it until he feels he's somewhat exhausted that subject. And then he'll turn to the next series. And very often one series predicts what the next series will be, because he'll find something in that series that he's working on that now will take him away from the basic format. So here, for example, is what's called a satellite painting. And here he's playing with that mandala shape again, but now it's very different. It's not centralized. It's cropped in the upper right-hand corner. It's pushed up. It's all cool colors, green and blue. And then it has this other small piece to our left, which looks like a part of a jigsaw puzzle that was pulled out of the central painting on the right. It's like a satellite revolving around its parent. So here he's interested very much in a couple of things, one of which is he's actually interested in the space between these two paintings, the wall, and where and how far away you can put the satellite affects how we perceive the painting. And he's beginning to really think about space and about the flatness of, certainly we'll talk about that, but of this kind of separating something from the sort of main focus. You can almost sense that in the mandala paintings, that these petals could sort of move, and that's what we were just looking at, where the painting looked like it almost sort of exploded that form. So here, when that form is intact, and this is a classic example along with number 17 that we started with, you see the petal shapes, you see, but most importantly, you see these 4 dots. In this case, they're blue. And they create a kind of, well, they create a square visually. And so even though the shapes are biomorphic, round, organic, he is implying a certain order through the idea of the square, which can be interpreted also as a cube. And then notice the lower right-hand corner. Here it's very subtle, but that's a different color in the lower right, where he cuts the painting, shall we say. By cut, I mean he just has this diagonally coming across from one side to the other, and in fact it's touching that green shape. And so a question is that actually overlapping or not? Is that the entire green shape? There's a tension here with edges. A lot of Paul Reed's paintings deal with the edge of things, whether he's cropping a composition, whether it's horizontal or vertical or diagonal, the edges that are created, where things stop and start. This is a painting that is certainly based on formalism, and most of the Washington Color School artists were certainly concerned, as you can see, obviously, with the formal language of painting. So color, brushstroke, shape, space, the relationship of two-dimensional to three-dimensional. These are the sort of building blocks of painting, even for an artist who's very expressive, like Van Gogh or somebody. Still, you're dealing with these formal aspects of painting. And for the DC Color School, these factors and how they could be altered, changed, intermingled, expressed through the flat surface, it becomes very, very important. And this painting in front of me is titled simply number 2B, B as in boy. But this was a painting that was, in fact, in that important 1965 exhibition in Washington, D.C. that brought these artists together. I don't actually think I've told you that story. So this group of what we call the DC Color School artists really came about in Washington, D.C. They knew each other. They were certainly friends and knew what each and every one was painting. But there was an exhibition at what was then known as the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. And it was curated by the director of that museum, Gerald Nordland. And he was the person who brought together, really for the first time, these 6 artists who became part of the DC Color School. So that included Morris Louis, Gene Davis, Kenneth Nolan, Thomas Downing, Howard Maring, and Paul Reed. They were all included in that exhibition. What was important about that exhibition as well is that a catalog was produced. And then what was equally important is that that exhibition traveled. It traveled widely to several other venues. So it was almost a kind of coming out party for these artists. This painting was in that exhibition, the 1965 exhibition. And this is one of Paul Reed's most disciplined and design-related paintings. You can sense that he sort of came to painting from graphic design, that he had worked in a linear drawing. He was drawing for his entire life. But this painting has a beautiful design element to it. The hot on the left, the cool on the right. One has to understand, when looking at any art like this, about complementary colors, colors that create high contrast, warm colors, cool colors, and certainly geometry, although geometry will play a bigger role coming up as we go through the exhibition. So this painting had almost everything that was now of concern to these artists, because it was also painting that was stained on unprocessed or unprimed cotton duck canvas. And that actually takes us to these two paintings here. These are the disc, so-called disc paintings. And next, after the Mandala series, this is the series that Reed began to experiment with. You can see certain things that relate back to the Mandala series, especially the cutting of the corners with different colors. So he's moving that. He's changing the support here. Now these are not square, they're rectangular. They're large scale, and some of these are also very large, 7 by 9 feet. And you have a certain vocabulary here. You have the stained sort of bluish purple. You have this disc, this round shape in the center, and then you have these two other colors that crop and cut the corners. So here, when you look at a painting like this, it begins to work on your eye. I'm not talking here about op art, things that are trying to fool your eye, things like that. But I'm talking about paintings that do have a certain kind of optical strength that captivates you if you spend the time. These are paintings that really require what we would call as slow looking. One might think as they pass by it that there's nothing there to see, but in fact it's just the opposite. You can see where that sort of lavender stain comes against the blue and the sort of pinkish square. So you'll see, and even where the disc itself runs. In other words, these paintings, for all of their geometry and precision and design, you still can see areas in almost all of these paintings that relate to the hand of the artist. It's not like this is a cookie cutter thing, but you can see places where staining comes together. So let's talk a little bit about staining. It relates here into what we've seen earlier. One of the hallmarks of the DC Color School was their process of painting, how they painted, and what was new about it. Now, what they began to do was to not prime a canvas and then paint with brushes and palette knives and create a very active surface, the things we associate with the New York school. Think of Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, certainly Jackson Pollock. Those artists were very expressive, very personal, very emotive, and their techniques were very much about paint, moving around in a very, at times, violent way. What we see with the DC Color School is a subtlety and a new approach to painting that, in fact, they inherited or were inspired by a New York school painter, and that is Helen Frankenthaler. And Helen Frankenthaler was already staining on unprimed cotton duck canvas. She would roll the canvas out on the floor, and then she would literally at times just take a little can or bottle or bowl of paint and begin to stain the surface. She would move it around with a squeegee or whatever. But the idea of the staining was that the color was now, the paint was not on the surface, it was in the surface. It was actually a part of the weave now of the canvas. This became a hallmark of the Washington, D.C. Color School, that they were exploring the ideas of staining, and it's true for all of them. Let's move to the next space. So in this room, in this large array of paintings, we see a shift in Paul Reed's thinking away from this circular mandala shape, away from even the circular and very evidently stained disc series, to paintings now that relate to what he called a geometry of painting. So he moves now to more linear relationships, forms that zig. Some of these paintings really relate to the idea of a zigzag shape, or a shape that sort of bends, but it does so in a precise way across the surface. And this implies a number of things. Again, if we come close to one of the paintings, when you look at these stripes, from a distance, sometimes they look very, very sharp and almost clinical. But when you come closer, you see that these edges bleed into each other, and there's a subsidiary kind of color going on. The artist he was actually thinking about in relationship to a painting like this, believe it or not, was Franz Kline, the American abstract expressionist, who painted mainly these wonderful canvases with black, active, aggressive brushstrokes that cut across the canvas in many ways, going right to the edge. And that idea of going right to the edge and bleeding out, as you see here, the idea is almost that these forms wrap around the painting, that they have a sort of three-dimensional, going around the painting. The painting that's particularly, a number of paintings here are parts of different series that he called the Upstart series, and he had different titles for these series based on what he was expressing or exploring. One of the important paintings is the one I chose for the cover of the catalog, is this one over here. So this is number 181 by Paul Reed from the 60s, and it's when he has moved into this more geometric phase, which is what basically is in this room that we're looking at here. And you notice I chose this picture, this painting, for the cover of the catalog because in many ways it expresses everything one needs to know about Paul Reed and the color school. First of all, this is not a square, it's a rectangle, but it's somewhat diminutive. It's not a large painting. The forms, the stripes, and the rolls of paint come down from the upper left to the lower right. There's a certain diagonal motion and impetus. You don't know where the strokes are coming from on the top, where the colors are originating, and you see them bleeding out at the edges, going around the edge of the painting. In a painting like this, and there's a photograph in the exhibition of Paul at work, he would use a roller, that you use a roller to paint your walls at home, but these were, in this case, it was a small 3-inch roller. So he would roll the paint on, and he had to be very careful about how quickly one layer would dry. He would try to do it when it's all, put everything down and keep it all wet, which is very difficult. But you can see how ragged some of these edges are. He's okay with things bleeding and creating this kind of stippled almost effect. The other thing, so this has the color, it has the dynamism of color school painting, although it's a dynamism that's sort of checked. It's not, again, it's not overly expressive. And then the white parts of this canvas are untouched. So this is staining onto an unprimed cotton duck canvas, and everything one needs to know about these artists to a certain extent is sort of represented in this particular painting. So we're in the room now devoted more or less to the really geometric paintings, not so much paintings based on biomorphic shapes or circles, but now we have a rigid kind of a grid system that he's exploring, and there's no better example than this painting here, which is titled Coherence, and it's from 1966. This is a painting that we actually own at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And along with this painting here, which is another Coherence, and so again, we're dealing with a series of paintings, you see how he's playing with this. This is a painting that runs horizontally. It has a certain rhythm because of that. This is a painting that runs vertically, and the lighter colors are at the top. And as you descend that sort of ladder, things get darker. What's particularly important in both of these paintings are these areas where the orange overlaps with one of those red colors to create even a different color. I mentioned that Reed was a painter for sure. He was a printmaker, he was a photographer, he was a sculptor. He worked in contemporary multimedia and computer-generated images. He lived a very long life. He lived to be 96. And what you find in Reed's art is that he's always changing. Artists very often, when they find their groove, shall we say, and they're getting praised for that particular type of painting, they just repeat that for the rest of their life. That's not what Paul Reed does. Paul Reed moves, and he's constantly pushing the envelope of what he wants to explore. In sculpture, the sculptures are small scale, and they relate to the paintings. For example, the sculpture that you see there that's stacked, like the painting here, you have a stacking of forms. Both of these, this one is step, and then that sculpture that's stacked. So that same idea. They're again clean, minimal. There's nothing there's certainly nothing decorative. The one I like the best is this sculpture here, which is called Mercury. So even though for the most part, he certainly early in his career, he didn't title paintings. They were just a number or they were untitled. But eventually he begins to give paintings titles. And in this sculpture, the title is Mercury, the messenger of the gods, who has the winged sandals. And so there's that sense here of movement. But what's really interesting here is what Reed said about this sculpture in terms of its inspiration. And he thought, or he was inspired by a sculpture by Auguste Rodin, the sculpture called Iris, Messenger of the Gods, which shows this partial figure of a woman. One leg is extended, but the other leg is just resting on point at the bottom. And that's how the whole sculpture is sort of supported. It's a very interesting concept. And so the idea of things on point will become more and more important to Reed. But he's certainly, again, a well-read. He knows mythology, he knows geography. Many of his titles that he used, one has to look up in an atlas what site or location he's actually referring to. So he had a very wide array of interests. This sculpture is painted, and this is an interesting sculpture because it was once a whole tube that was then cut along the lengthwise, which is very tricky. And so you have these two sort of scalloped shapes. So he's playing with that. And then he brings color into the equation here. This side of the sculpture that's concave is hot, all hot colors, orange, red, yellow. The other side is green and blue, cool colors. Now, the one thing I should mention about Paul Reed in relationship to these sculptures, the one thing Paul Reed didn't know how to do was to weld. He was not a welder like David Smith. So in sculptures where he needed to have works welded in order to join shapes to each other, he had a friend named Bill Truitt, who was indeed a very skilled welder. And so what Reed would do is to design all of these sculptures, work on paper. We have numerous sketches where he's experimenting with different varieties of shapes and cadence. And then he would collaborate with Bill Truitt, who would actually follow his instructions about where something should be welded. So those people who know Reed's art, probably what they would know, the Mandala series is a certain one, the disc series. But now we come into a new arena, which is the shaped canvas, where he begins to actually shape a canvas, create a canvas that comes off of the wall in some fashion. This was certainly not unique to just Paul Reed. Many other American painters were involved in the wall and how to relate this language between sculpture, painting, and the flat surface. This painting is interesting because it kind of gives you a hint of what's to come. This is a painting that is four-sided. He begins to experiment with 4, 5, 6, 7 sides, even more. And here, one of the things that's most evident relates to what I just mentioned about this sculpture that influenced him by Rodin. This is a painting that rests on a point. In other words, it's not along a flat, level, vertical, or horizontal. It actually rests on a point. As soon as you have something resting on a point, there's an inherent sort of feeling of it tilting one way or another. And in order to prevent that feeling from sort of overwhelming us, how he uses the various formal elements of the bars, the shapes, and the colors to make this, again, a beautifully unified painting, even though it's a painting on a point. And that takes us to the pure shaped canvases here. This is one of the most beautiful walls in the exhibition. And we have 3 of the shaped canvases, and 2 of these belong here in the Oklahoma Permanent Collection. So he begins now to literally think of how to create the idea of a shaped canvas coming off the wall. The painting on the far right, which is here in Oklahoma, is one of his best. It's called Step. And you can see how things come off of the surface and begin to imply this idea of a step sort of space. It's important, I know this sounds maybe a little overly trivial, but it's important to look at the edges of his paintings, to look at the edges and to see what he's doing and how he wants the painting, this edge comes into the wall. So these are paintings that are magnificent. These are among his best works. And there's so many different ways you can access these shaped canvases. So among the shaped canvases, very often they increase in scale, and 2 of the largest are the 2 paintings here behind me. To my right, to your left is Hackensack, and to the right is Ziegfeld. And this shows you how he begins to expand the painting. Now it really is engaging space and the wall in a very dramatic way. The Hackensack painting is 14 feet high. Now, to do a painting like that, obviously you need a large studio, a studio space that could accommodate that. And Reed did have an important, wonderful studio in DC, along with a lot of his colleagues, Gene Davis and others, and they shared spaces, et cetera. And he lost his studio. There was a fire, and there were issues with the landlord, et cetera. And he lost his big studio. And that's when he went basically to have his studio at home in Arlington, Virginia. But before all that, he was taking full advantage of scale because he had a large studio that allowed him to now, 14 feet high, that's pretty impressive. And these are 2 really important, beautiful paintings. On this opposite wall are shaped canvases as well, but a little bit different. Because here he's brought back the idea that we've already mentioned, and that's the hole or the space that reveals the wall beneath. So this is not painted, this is an opening here and on the right. And from that opening, he can create a geometric kind of relationship that both speaks to the 2 dimensions and to the 3 dimensions of painting, and again relates to his color, how we read color in terms of primary colors, complementary colors. There is a kind of basic understanding of color theory that helps one to access some of Reed's art, but he's not overly dictatorial or theoretical like somebody like Joseph Albers. He uses those ideas in a more flexible and not so much necessarily in an empirical sort of way. So another beautiful shaped canvas that's actually very complicated. This is called PASS, P-A-S-S. And if you get close, you'll notice it's in sections. And to create a stretcher for this painting was very difficult. And what had to be done was to create the stretcher in sections and then have them bolted together. So on the opposite side of this painting, it's a very complex web of the wooden stretcher. Here he introduced as well, and this became something fairly common, this idea of glitter, those kind of sparkly sort of effects that one sees across the surface. The sort of painted part, if we can say that, relates to what we saw very early in all over composition. And that was very important to a lot of these artists, covering the entire surface. But then there's the geometry. This is just a really powerful painting. Another series is represented by this corner here. And these are the paintings he titled Barcelona. And remember, he was also a very important printmaker. So you see prints as well as sculpture, as well as painting, and the shaped canvases. He worked with a number of master printers when he was in Washington, D.C. He worked with Lou Stovall, who was one of the great printmakers in the district, who passed away just recently in 2023. And he spent time in Arizona, Reed did, and he worked with another master printer at Arizona State University named Joe Segura. The Barcelona series has this almost kind of, people refer to it as a kind of a rocket shape that looks like it's about to blast off. Here it's very complicated when you try to count the edges. And all of that, at first you think there are only 7 or 8, then you realize you have to count the edges that are in the middle there as well, and you get up to sort of 15. But one of the things that's important here, Paul was a professor at the Corcoran in Washington, D.C. For almost 10 years or so. He was a very important, in addition to being a painter, he was a very important teacher in Washington, D.C. There are a whole host of students that he taught who went on to have an important career. So he made an impact, not just as an artist, but also as an educator. When you look at his class notes, and we have some of his class notes here in the archive in Oklahoma. One of the things, and you can see how he's teaching students, in this painting, what he says is important is to find the axis, the main axis. So the main axis of this painting really is from the corner all the way up to the top, if you were to diagram this painting. And that's interesting because the left doesn't echo the right. It's on a point, no less. And it reveals the wall. It has an opening. And so this is a painting that just sort of encapsulates so many of his interests: color, shape, geometry, flatness, axial ideas. Paul was very interested and influenced by Renaissance theory of art, most especially the idea of the golden ratio. And this was something that artists in the Renaissance were fixated on. And Paul was very influenced by those theoretical artists in the Renaissance who very often created their paintings based on this kind of geometry, most especially the painter Piero della Francesca, because you can diagram Piero's paintings and they become this incredible geometric pattern comparable to what Paul is often doing here. This is the Gilport series. And the Gilport series comes about in the 70s. And now he's, again, experimenting, changing things. The Gilport paintings are 2 unstretched painted canvases that are then tacked or pinned to the wall. They're not put on stretchers. So they're just the canvas. Here at the museum here, fortunately, instead of using tacks, they've used magnets to hold the pieces to the metal that's in the back. There's an opening in the center that separates the 2 parts. And then there's a rectangle that's separated as well. And when you start to calculate the size of the rectangle to the size of the opening and these different relationships, if you were to push this together and make it one unified sort of composition, how would that look? What's the difference between that and separating the canvases? You have the hard edge. Well, hard edge isn't the best term, but you have the sharp outlines of the rectangular form, but then you have this beautiful painterly, atmospheric, almost diaphanous curtain of paint that's part of the painting as well. So that it creates a whole nother element of interest. The other thing to keep in mind, when you have 2 separate sections, we have bifocal vision. And very often we're not, with one glance at something, we're not actually understanding the whole thing. And here there's actually even a relationship to the idea that we have 2 eyes and see 2 halves, and that relationship is interesting to experiment with. So this is the Gilport series from the 70s. We're moving ahead. I wanted to show you this print because this is a collaboration. And here he was working with Lou Stovall in DC. For a time, Paul was employed by the Peace Corps. And that was mainly as a designer. So he designed all of their newsletters and magazines and graphic work, and very often posters for various events. So this was a poster for the Peace Corps. Now what we have here is Paul Reed creating this design. He created what you see here, but then it was printed by Lou Stovall. So it was a collaboration between Reed and Stovall. This long quote here comes from Albert Schweitzer. So there's that collaboration. And again, looking again at Reed's evolution, for a time he works at the Peace Corps. He's a graphic designer for a number of advertising agencies. He's an educator, so he has a vast array of material and experience to draw upon. So I mentioned that when Paul Reed lost his large studio, he begins to work at home, essentially. He has a studio that's down in the basement of his house in Arlington, Virginia. And he turns to smaller scaled works. He turns to working with oil pastels, with gouache, certainly pencil, colored pencil. And some of these two works here are actually part of a kind of a sketchbook where he's working out ideas. And they're fascinating because they have a kind of mechanical as well as expressive. Sometimes they look almost like there's some kind of scientific contraption that has a sort of spatial relationship. He combines these things and he begins to think about diptychs and triptychs, two-paneled works, three-paneled works, as you see here, and that relate to each other or that speak to each other. What you see here is Reed sort of returning to nature, you might say, because he begins to represent in these collages actual locations that people can identify, but he creates this interesting amalgam of halves of things so that you're looking at one thing that's a reversal of the other. Sometimes he puts something that's a photograph against a photograph of a landscape or something against the Greek sculpture. So you see there are lots of dialogues in these works, the past and the present, the classical and the abstract, all of that. And so these are among his later works where he could, again, the scale is very manageable here. He also worked, interestingly enough, with stencils. And in this painting, what he had cut out a series of essentially stencils, and he would have these stencils that he could lay out sort of like puzzle pieces and then shift around and move to create a composition that you see here. Here, again, the color, the hot and the cool. But what's interesting here are some of these actual shapes. These claw-like shapes at the top, and this claw-like shape at the bottom, sort of like a crab or a crustacean. So when you look at these works, they have interesting little sort of sidelights. And in this case, that claw-like shape is actually kind of threatening. It's kind of aggressive. And that's coming again from Surrealism. The Surrealists had created a whole lexicon of being aggressive to the viewer and showing things that look anthropomorphic or animal-like. You think of Max Ernst again, Joan Miro, things that are pinched and perforated and punctured, all of that. And that's certainly relevant here. I mean, Reed has an encyclopedic knowledge of art history. You almost had to if you were a professor teaching art, as he did at the Corcoran. Many of his students are still very much with us, people I know, friends of mine, quite frankly. So he, as a teacher, that was an important part of his reputation. Let's just curl around here. Here's another one of the collage photographic works. This is a mountain range in Arizona. I think I mentioned that Reed spent time in Arizona and California, but especially Arizona. So here you see the idea of multiple images brought together in a somewhat cubist kind of way, but very recognizable here. The Las Vegas print there. One of the beautiful works is this work at the top here from the Phillips collection. It's again one of these gouache sort of watercolor works, but when you really look at this work, it has the most incredibly beautiful surface. And the surface is almost sort of velvety. It's almost a surface you expect from a Conte crayon. If you know the drawings of Georges Seurat, those very atmospheric drawings, it's almost that effect here, how things overlap, etc. So this is a particularly lovely work. Again, diptychs, triptychs, as we pointed out. Now there's another change here in the corner, and we have three works now that are diamond shaped on the point, and they're these large, in fact there's a lot of paint on these surfaces, but the way he's creating the surface now is through scraping. He has a sort of plastic scraper, somewhat like the scraper you use to get the ice off of your window in the wintertime, and he scrapes through the paint as you see it. And there is, in this case, there is paint visibly on the surface. It's not a staining. There's impasto here. So that you have a sort of, again, in this case, certainly the sense of the artist's confrontation with his materials. Here the edge tension is different because they're being stopped, whereas in the other examples they're being cut across the boundary. And then this painting is interesting because in some ways, even though this is from 1995, he's referring back really to the mandala, because there is in this painting a circular, centralized, yellow sunlight shape that seems to, he's picking back up what he had done years ago. So another series, it's a new element that he begins to experiment with, is represented in this painting by these lines. These have been called a number of different things, rafts, slats, boards, whatever. In any case, this is a particularly interesting one. I selected this painting for a particular reason. There are many variations of this idea of the slats. You can see, again, on that wall behind us, if we go across, you'll see a similar thing. But the black and white and gray is interesting because that really speaks to where he first got the idea. And believe it or not, it was when he looked at Renoir's The Painting of the Loge from 1874, that's in the Courtauld, and you have that woman in the opera box and she sort of has her hand out on the edge of the box, but her sleeve is beautifully it's sort of a puffy sleeve, and it has black and white sort of pattern. And when he saw that painting, that sort of was the impetus for exploring things like this. On the left is where he takes the same idea of these slats, but now he superimposes them on photographs that he had taken. A similar relationship here. And then later, he sort of took the slats and decided, in essence, to sort of just bring them all together into a kind of a square or a rectangle, and that's what you see here, where he's superimposing now this actual kind of material that has texture over this very painterly background. In many ways, these squares come out from the slats in many ways. He deals here with reverse imagery. He's playing with perspective here. Sometimes people think these slats are parallel. They're not. They would eventually converge at some point in space. And late in his career, when he's working at home, he was working in his basement. He didn't have a lot of space. He did have a patio. If the weather was good, he could work outside as well. But he began to do a series of paintings on muslin, just this diaphanous muslin material that's very transparent. And he began to paint what you see here. And he would paint these flat. They would be on a table, and then he would paint them, different color relationships. But the whole idea is what he did with these. He was painting these, to a large extent for himself, to hang in the windows of his house. So when you visited his house, his windows were filled with these muslin paintings. And of course, the sunlight and the light coming in was affected by the color of the muslin. And he had created, in some ways, his own Matisse Chapel, or Rothko Chapel, or Ellsworth Kelly Chapel. So this is a beautiful installation here, because you can't fully appreciate these works unless they are hung in a window or hung somewhere where light can penetrate them. So here, the works are in a light box. So if you come up, and you touch this button, it then shows you sort of how it would look if it were hanging in somebody's window. And that's true over here. So once light penetrates these, and you can see clearly the weave of the fabric. In some ways, it's a kind of culmination of many of his interests. And the very last paintings to talk about are these two. He died in 2015, and these are paintings from 2014. And these two paintings kind of go together because they relate to an interest that he had in his later years and conversations that he was having with a physicist, an astrophysicist, who lived in Virginia, who worked for NASA, and who admired Paul's work, and they had met. And that began a friendship where this gentleman, this physicist, would come and visit Paul on a regular basis. And they would discuss especially science, and especially physics, and especially quantum mechanics. All of this was fascinating to Paul Reed. And what he learned about was this Higgs boson as this particle that physicists have identified, but they can't see it. The only way you can identify it is by what it leaves behind when it sort of loses its form. In other words, the detritus sort of shows you that that thing existed. This is his painting called Boson, Boson number 2. There are 4 different ones where he was trying to, he thought about that, something, a particle disintegrating, a particle, I mean, it sort of captivated him. And then that takes us to this really interesting painting below, which has a very long title, and it comes directly from physics. 73% solution 2 is the title. And what that refers to is the discussion among physicists about how much of matter can be actually sort of seen. And apparently the percentage is 73%. He was fascinated with that idea. And he just kept thinking about it. And then he did his painting on muslin, and it's very interesting. This might perhaps be the very last painting he painted. And it's the dark matter and the light, and it does speak, I don't know if you want to say it's a pessimistic painting or just a realist painting, or it's certainly theoretical if you know where it's coming from, what his inspiration was. It is in some ways a very fitting painting to be among his very last paintings. From late in life, from Virginia, he moved to Arizona, and he lived in the Phoenix area, and he died in 2015 in Arizona. So the thing about Paul Reed is that he is, first of all, this retrospective was long overdue. He should have had a major retrospective many years ago. It just never happened. He's a very important member of that color school, but of course, because of his longevity, living into his 90s, and somebody who didn't just rest on his laurels, he pushed himself to create an entire body of work that has tremendous variety all the way up to the paintings that you're seeing here. So we're very happy and proud to present this retrospective here at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, because they do have now the largest repository of Reed's work, and they have the whole collection that I just barely mentioned that had come in the 60s from the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. A lot of this is discussed in our catalog about all of those things. So I think with that, I'll say farewell.